today to have you join us for a plenary session on safeguarding the U.S. research enterprise. This session is being brought to you courtesy of FIG, otherwise known as the FDP Foreign Influence Working Group that Jim Luther and I co-chair. We are so delighted today to have 5 of our closest federal colleagues joining us and to cover a whole variety of topics on this core issue that is impacting all of us every day, all the time. And there's a lot that's been going on. So they're going to give us an update. Next slide. We had a really hard time with FIG deciding whether we wanted to focus on developments with the common disclosure forms and with what's going on in NIH and NSF, or if we wanted to cover what's going on with NSPM 33 and the CHIPS and Science Act. So we decided on both. And so we're going to have a 2-part, and you can see here what we're planning to cover. And with that, I'll ask Jim to introduce our panelists for the day. Next slide.
Thanks, Pamela. So as Pamela mentioned, 2 parts to this discussion. Most of our presenters need no introduction. You can see their names here, but we're delighted to have Dr. Rebecca Kaiser. Rebecca's come many times to this group and is going to talk about some of the exciting things from an NSPM 33 as well as the CHIPS and the new functions of many of the things that were talked about in this framework for some time. And her deputy chief, Sarah Stalker-LaHoo, is joining us as well, which I think, Rebecca, is a reasonably recent addition to your office, which is wonderful. So it's wonderful to have her on this call as well. And then Jason Day, also from DOD, is joining us to talk about these types of issues. And then, as Pamela mentioned, as you can see on this slide, the Common Disclosure Form, our great friends Michelle and Jean are here to talk about this really important issue. If you remember from the very, very beginning, harmonization was the #1 element that came out of the thought exchange. And Jean and Michelle and others are executing on that. So we're excited to hear about that as well. Next slide. So we talked about most of this. I think the important thing to clarify here is that we'll have Q&A after each of the sections. I think we'll have adequate time for both. I think Sarah gave an overview of how to ask the Q&A. Pamela and I will be monitoring that, as will all of the presenters. We'll make sure there were some interesting goings on with how questions were being asked and answered. So we'll try to make sure that even if our presenters answer it through the Q&A function, that we make sure that we repeat the important ones for this group, and we'll make sure that we track these as well. Next slide. Pamela and I are not going to waste a lot of time going over NSPM 33 and CHIPS. This was a similar slide that we used 2 or 3 months ago, and it talks about the highlights of various aspects related to NSPM 33 as well as the common forms. We provide this and some of the things that Pamela is going to talk about here in a moment more as reference because we'd much rather hear the presenters present and do the Q&A than go into the details of some of the things that we've talked about. But we did want to include it here just as a comprehensive part of the background and the context. Next slide, and back to you, Pamela.
Thanks, Jim. Yes, we wanted to give you for reference, there's so much in the CHIPS and Science Act, and it's easy to lose track of what piece of requirement is coming forward to all of us from where. And so we wanted to give you this, which is excerpted from a great summary that AAU did of the CHIPS and Science final security provisions around research. I'm not going to go through these, but I will mention on each of these 3 screens here, just one of them on each to call your attention to it. And one is that NSF was ahead of the game because they had already created Rebecca Kaiser's office as the Office of Research, Security, and Policy, but that was ratified in the CHIPS Act itself. So if you look at that first one, the CHIPS and Science Act required that NSF set up this office that they had already achieved. Next slide. The one I'd like to point out here is the one in the middle about foreign financial support. I imagine that our panelists are going to say a bit more about this. In fact, part of the reason we're not going through these in detail is I know they already have a wealth of information about some of these important areas in their presentations. But we know that institutions are concerned about this coming new requirement about providing NSF with a summary of financial support for contracts of $50,000, gifts and contracts more than $50,000. So we'll look forward to hearing more about that one in particular. Next slide. This is my favorite, though, of all of the provisions, and that's non-discrimination. So I just want to point that out to everyone is we've all been very concerned, and NSPM 33 does a great job of making it clear that discrimination will not be tolerated. And the CHIPS Act reinforces that with this section that says that whatever we do in this space, it must not target, stigmatize, or discriminate against individuals. And I just want to point that out. And basically, I think we're all very grateful that that's a context in which all of the rest of this is being designed. Again, this is here for your reference. If you're trying to find something, hopefully having these section numbers will help you navigate to it more rapidly. Next slide. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca so she can walk us through these provisions and the latest that's happening with them. Rebecca?
Thank you, Pamela. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. And I'm very thrilled to have a Deputy CRISP, Deputy Chief of Research Security Strategy and Policy, Sarah Stocker-LaHoo. And as Pamela said, I'm authorized now to create my office, which is the Office of the CRISP, the OCRISP. So we're moving forward. Even though my title is the Chief of Research Security Strategy and Policy, I really like the title of this session, which is Safeguarding the Research Enterprise. And as you can see, I think as our understanding of the issues evolves and our understanding of what we need to do about these issues evolve, we're starting to use this framing of safeguarding science, safeguarding research a lot more, because I think it emphasizes that we all need to partner to ensure that we maintain the openness and transparency and reciprocity of our research enterprise. This is not just a US effort, this is an international effort, and I've been working closely with the G7 on this, as well as with many other partners. If we have time during the Q&A, I can go into that as well. But I did want to focus on the latest and greatest with the implementation guidance and the CHIPS and science research security provisions. And thank you, Pamela, for outlining where these are. I think it's very helpful. If you do a Google search, you can now look for those sections. Next slide, please. So NSPM 33 implementation guidance. We have our wonderful Jean and Michelle here who are going to go into the harmonization of the disclosure requirements and formats, and they'll have a whole session on that. So I won't delve into that. But what I will say is that we've been working hard on developing the standards for the research security program requirements, which in NSPM 33 implementation guidance is a requirement for institutions receiving more than $50 million in federal R&D funding to put such a program in place. These standards are going to come out for public comment through an RFI process from OSTP, and it'll be out for 90 days. We are crossing our fingers it comes out soon. It's still going through the review process, and so I wish I had a specific exact date, but as soon as we have that date, I'll be sure to let you all know. And then as far as what we're doing next, number one, the certification process for these research security programs and how you will certify that you have one. We're looking at self-certifications and the process for that and the system through which you certify is being coordinated, and so that information will be out shortly as well. There's also the requirement for U.S. government agencies to have a policy in NSPM 33 implementation guidance on digital persistent identifiers. The establishment of these is encouraged, as you know. It's not required, but strongly encouraged. So we have a digital persistent identifier working group under the NSTC's research subcommittee that's developing some guidelines for the U.S. government agencies so that we can implement that as part of our processes. NSF has been working hard on this as well, and perhaps Jean can also touch on that during her remarks. Next slide, please. Now, as far as CHIPS and science research security provisions, there are several provisions. I won't go through all of them in detail, but I will give you somewhat of a status. I also have a slide, feel free to use it. These slides are for distribution, that does have the CHIPS and science definition of a malign foreign talent recruitment program. And then a little bit of an outline of what we're supposed to do to set up an information sharing and analysis organization. So a little bit more detail. There is a prohibition for those who are going to receive or applying for federal research funding of being part of a malign foreign government talent recruitment program. And there's a definition of that in CHIPS and science. Now, what it says is that someone applying for federal funding needs to certify that they are not at the time of application part of one of these programs, and they cannot be part of one of these programs during the term of their federal grant. So this is not retroactive. This is at that time. And so we are in the process within the funding agency's whole structure and within NSF of developing an approach for that certification that you're not part of the malign foreign government talent recruitment programs. It's going to take some time to put it into the NSF system, the certification system. And so you will get notification, of course, of when this will be implemented and the certification will take place. At the same time, there is also the prohibition on anyone working for the federal government being part of an overall talent recruitment program, foreign government talent recruitment program, malign or not malign. Many agencies have already implemented that prohibition, and the additional implementation is being coordinated through OSTP on that. The second is the requirement to establish a research security and integrity information sharing and analysis organization. That's a long title, and so we're calling it the Risk Assessment Center on Research Security and Integrity. Formal name to be announced. I have another slide on, again, what this has to entail, and so I'll talk to that in a few minutes. The third is the research security training requirement for all covered personnel. And so again, there has to be the expansion of responsible and ethical conduct of research training to all covered personnel as well as to the graduate students. There has to be the inclusion of research security training as part of that. NSF has collaborated with NIH, Department of Energy, Department of Defense, with FBI as a technical interface. And we have funded 4 awards for modules to develop modules through cooperative agreements in research security training. These are 1-year awards, and so the modules will be delivered by the end of this calendar year. We're in the process of developing the approach to make sure that we have a good delivery mechanism for these modules so that they're readily available. And then the reporting on foreign financial transactions and gifts that Pamela mentioned. NSF has a new requirement for the submission of a report annually from institutions of higher education that NSF funds. So you have to be an NSF awardee, grantee, and it's for transactions above $50,000 with countries of concern. And countries of concern are defined in CHIPS and Science. We're in the process of developing the reporting system for these annual reports, as well as the policy and the requirements. We know that there'll be a lot of questions coming up about what needs to be reported and what doesn't, especially at the $50,000 threshold. We're coordinating closely with Department of Education, even though there are some differences in what needs to be reported to us and reported to Department of Ed. Our overall objective is to make a user-friendly reporting system with very clear requirements. And so we're not going to release this and require this reporting until we have that in place. When we do that, it will be coordinated with Department of Education. I can't guarantee you it'll be the exact same system, but it will be coordinated, again, because of some of these differences in what needs to be reported. So more to come on that. And then the prohibition of Confucius Institutes. You saw that the National Academies has submitted a report on Confucius Institutes with a second half of the report on Confucius-like institutes and what that might be defined as. That's going to be coming out this spring. After that report comes out, NSF is going to be closely coordinating with Department of Defense to have a harmonized waiver process for Confucius Institutes and Confucius-like institutes so that we're consistent for the community. Next slide, please. So again, this is the definition of a aligned foreign talent recruitment program. These are the aspects of these programs that we have found particularly concerning. I think we all find these concerning, and I'm hoping that having the definition here is going to be helpful to everyone. We went back and forth about should there be a list of these programs that might be prohibited or not. Lists are challenging, things change, names change, and so we thought a definition would be best. We're here to coordinate with you as this gets implemented because we know that there are concerns. We do encourage institutions to request contracts and agreements from principal investigators so that we can all assist in determination about whether something is a malign foreign government talent recruitment program, whether it fits the definition or not. And I know that that is a challenge, but we're here to work with you on that. Please note this last part of this definition. Any foreign government talent recruitment program that is sponsored by a country of concern is defined as malign per CHIPS and Science. Next slide, please. In the training modules, we made the awards and we have 4 modules. Note one of the modules is on international collaboration, and I feel that that's extremely important to emphasize the importance of collaboration and to help with training about how to determine beneficial international collaborations and distinguish them from improper foreign government influence. We also have a module on disclosures overall. We have a module on research security and what it is. And then we have a module on risk and how to assess risk. And so these are being worked collaboratively between the awardees and a government content expert group. Next slide, please. Oh, and I think we only have the second half of the duties here for some reason, and I'm sure it's my cut and paste. But anyway, overall, the Risk Assessment Center has 3 major roles in my view. The first role is to provide tools to the community. And again, this needs to be a non-governmental organization that serves the community for risk, research security and integrity information. The tools are extremely important. How does one assess risk? How can you address risk? What does risk mean overall, especially in fundamental research? So this center is going to help with that. The second part is information sharing. So this is information sharing on research security and integrity issues, again, to safeguard the research enterprise and provide that information from the government, and also share information among those in the community on different areas of both risks as well as benefits of particular international collaborations. The third aspect is engagement. We want to make sure that this is a center where there's an opportunity for discussion, for interface, and that it's not something that is just a one-way conversation, which is not a conversation, that's a lecture. That's what we don't want. We want to make sure that this is a partnership that we all have. Now, we are in the process now, as you can imagine, of interpreting some of these things that are in CHIPS and Science. For instance, CHIPS and Science says that the center should provide reports on incidents. We are not quite sure what an incident is, and so we're in the process of developing an approach to that. And again, things even like the definition of what a risk is. So we're in the process of developing the overall remit for this center. The next step is that we plan to send out a Dear Colleague letter to the community to solicit white papers from the community on what you would like to see from such a center, what would be interesting to you. And then we also are going to have additional community engagement. So we're talking with Pamela and Jim about ways that we might be able to use the Federal Demonstration Partnership to, again, get more of this engagement and have some fora to make sure that when we formulate this center, we respond to community needs. And I think that's my last slide. So overall, these are just things that we're thinking about. What is the overall remit? How do we engage with stakeholders? And again, what the U.S. government steering committee that's going to interface with this center is going to be. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rebecca. Jason? And Rebecca, we'll hit Q&A right after so that we can chat with you and Jason at the same time. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think Rebecca has done a great job, as always, of covering, the interagency and what the interagency is working on. I can sort of back clean up and then tell you a little bit about what the department is doing to implement some of those things within DoD. For one thing to start with, the Confucius Institute study that Rebecca mentioned, we are going to be establishing a waiver process as is required by the statute in the FY21 NDAA that set up the study. And so you'll have more information about that upcoming shortly. Within the department, the NSPM 33 and the challenge we've had with implementing both CHIPS and Science and NSPM 33 and all of these types of activities are that they do a good job of telling us what are the things that we should be asking for from the community in terms of disclosures and all these other types of things, and their digital persistent identifiers and that type of activity, but it doesn't say what we should do with it. And another one of our themes in all of this, and this has come from OSTP, has been that we want to harmonize as much as possible, and we want to be as transparent as possible in what decisions we're making and why. And so the department, the way that we have begun to implement things is our DoD components have been engaging in pilot programs to try to use the information that's disclosed within research applications to make some risk assessments. And I think as with any pilot program, we're not going to get everything right at the very beginning. And we have had enough time now, I think, to analyze some of the early results that we've gotten. And I think from a DoD perspective, what we see in this is that there are some inconsistencies in between DoD components. And what we've identified is that there needs to be a little bit further guidance from the department to the components to help standardize both within DoD components. So from if you go to Army or Navy or Air Force, you get about the same type of risk review, and also to harmonize, in the interagency. So a DoD review shouldn't look, materially different than an NSF review or an NIH review. And so that's what we're trying to do. We had the Deputy Secretary of Defense signed out a memorandum in December saying, directing the Undersecretary for Research and Engineering, so that would be my big boss, to put out a plan within 90 days of how these risk reviews, so the reviews based on the disclosure information, is going to be conducted within the department. And so we are fast at work on trying to assemble something. And, I can't share with you what the contents of that are going to be because that's all pre-decisional at the moment. But what I can say is that our goal with this is, I think it will mirror a lot of the things that you see in the NSPM 33 implementation guide. And it will also, try to harmonize as much as possible between the different components. And our other goal is to make sure that there is a rationale that is provided. So if, for example, if for some reason a DoD component makes a decision that based on the information disclosed, that it cannot make an award for research risk or security reasons, some sort of unclassified rationale will be given to the institution that explains that decision. And I think that's important because we don't want the community to be guessing or left guessing as to why the department is making certain decisions or why a review is coming back the way that it is. That's something that we've heard from some of the early pilot program results. So that's one of the things we're going to try to address. We also are going to work on with the interagency on some of the Chips and Science Act definitions of foreign talent program. There is a DoD component to that because the lists that the department is required to of certain institutions, the department is required to collect of institutions, foreign institutions that have engaged in what would be considered problematic behaviors. Those are examples of any program sponsored by one of those organizations would be considered a malign foreign talent program. So we're trying at the moment, we're going to work with the interagency, figure out what's the best way to make that clear to the community. Again, it's difficult to have lists of programs, so we want to be able to communicate that in a way that is most transparent to everyone. So those are a couple of the things that we're working on. Again, I think the other thing I can say is that on DPI policy, we are working alongside the interagency. We are going to be going down the route of signing up with ORCID. As I think if you read NSPM 33, it's pretty clear that that's the direction that that is the intention for agencies to go, but we're going to be making that an official policy of the department. The only, I think, wrinkle in DoD's implementation of ORCID versus NSF NIH are that NSF and NIH both use Science CV. And for the department, given that the department has so many different components, it is very difficult to require all of them to implement Science EV, something like that, in a reasonable time frame. So, the precise way that we use the information from a DPI, that'll be a work that's ongoing. But we do intend to mirror what the rest of the federal family is doing on DPIs and on research security writ large. So more to come on all those things, but that's my update for now, and we can get to some questions on, or are we going to the next topic?
I think we'll do some questions now, Jason. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. That was great, Jason and Rebecca. Thank you very much. Pamela, did you have a question or two? Or do you want to, maybe we should start with the ones in the answered section to make sure everybody has seen or heard them?
It would be good if we started with the one. Rebecca's been kind enough to answer some, but we do have about 450 people online and they may not all be aware of it. So we'll go ahead, and they seem to be of general interest. So we'll go ahead. The first one, Rebecca, is it safe to assume that the prohibition on malign foreign talent programs will be at the individual and not the institutional level?
So the law itself says that there's a prohibition for covered personnel, meaning principal investigators and co-principal investigators. So the law is the individual level. Now, implementation is something that we are still in the process of developing the approach to certification. As we all know, it's the institution that applies for the grant and is the technical awardee. We have implemented at NSF some individual certifications, however, for current and pending support and BioSketch. I think that's right. And Jean, correct me if I'm wrong. And so we're in the process of developing that overall approach to this. Within NSF, we have a working group that's working on this, and so there'll be more information. And we're also coordinating among the interagency through the Research Security Subcommittee. So more to come.
Okay, great.
That was correct, by the way, in terms of what and how NSF originally did the NDAA 2021-223 requirement.
Thank you.
Great. The next one, Rebecca, is about the Risk Assessment Center. And I think there's a lot of excitement around that from the standpoint of a one-stop shop. And the question here is it only for NSF, or are there other funding agencies that are going to be involved?
So right now, NSF is planning on providing the majority of the funding starting with 2023. And of course, we welcome partnering with other federal agencies, whoever would like to join. We are planning on having a U.S. government steering committee as well that's going to have participation from NSF, from other funding agencies, and from other parts of the U.S. government. For instance, we feel it's important for Department of State to be part of this steering group, some other federal agencies to be part of the steering group. And so that'll be part of it as well. When I say steering group, I want to be clear that this is going to be funded through a non-governmental organization. And so the steering group from the government is going to be to coordinate how we can convey information to this non-governmental organization and make sure it's unclassified for it to be provided out through the center.
Thank you.
That's great. That's really helpful. And when we distribute this PowerPoint, Rebecca, it would be great to get that missing slide of 1 through 4. Sarah, that's wonderful. Sarah has put it in the chat. Again, not sure if everybody has seen the chat, but if I could ask one follow-up on that. So many of these items in the 1 through 8 are fairly generic and broad and application across agencies, which again is wonderful. As you think through the execution of their office and the risk assessment functions it will do, there has been, and you've probably been asked this question before, what insights will institutions have in how you conduct a risk assessment so that we can learn from that and apply that locally? I know you've been asked a version of that before, but could you talk a bit about that?
Absolutely. We're going to be very clear about what the methodology is through which we would do this type of risk assessment. Something that that we're emphasizing very much is making sure that we have a clear and transparent validation process for whatever information we provide out through this risk assessment center. I think it's the only way the center is going to be sustainable is to make sure that everybody's confident in the information. At the same time, as you said, 2 things. Number one, it would be wonderful if we can have the tools for how one assesses risk and have that be transparent and provided through the center so that institutions can use it. We have gotten some feedback, of course, that institutions have varying levels of capabilities and resources. And so the ability for each institution to do that type of risk assessment center might vary. So I think it does have to be a combination of tools as well as information itself. When we provide information on the risk, this center, we're going to be very clear, is not a policy-making center. It's not a center that's going to tell anyone what to do, nor can it. It doesn't have that mandate. And so when we provide information, I think it's going to be more along the lines of, here's some traits, characteristics, aspects that you should take into consideration, both pro and con, when you're considering something like working with a particular entity or some particular international program that may or may not have concerning aspects to it, and here's why. So that's the kind of thing that I envision providing out through the center.
That's great, because that sounds like a scalable model from a $50 million organization to a $2 billion organization, of which all of those are on this call, right? That full range. So that's great. Pamela?
So we know that a lot of institutions have, over the last few years, closed their Confucius Institutes. But there's a question that has been asked about how one would know if you still had one at your institution, or if there's a master list to check on that, or even if you're doing business with them and you want to know whether or not another institution has one.
Yes, it's a very good question. And Jason, do you know, did the National Academy study, did they provide a list of the current Confucius Institutes? Because I believe there are 7 left.
I think that they did. I'm blanking on whether or not that there was a list. Most of the institutions that are left are not at R1 institutions. I think that there may be only 1 or 2 R1 institutions that are represented that have Confucius Institutes currently, and even some of the 7, but I think they were focused on DoD funding, but I think some of the 7 had no DoD funding whatsoever. So that probably gives an indication of the size of the institution.
That's right.
But we will. So the department at back in when we first received this the statutory language in the NDAA, the department wrote letters to the Confucius Institutes that the department was aware of to ask about future plans. So, the department does have some information on that, and, we'll be able to work with those institutions going forward.
Thank you.
A follow-up to that. It seems like, Jason and Rebecca, in the old days, talent programs were named talent programs, and Confucius Institutes were named Confucius Institutes, right? I mean, I would imagine in both cases, foreign talent programs and Confucius Institutes might have different names and might really be one of those. How do institutions deal with that when it's not clear in the future if something is a talent program or something is a Confucius Institute, of how they interact with them?
Jason, do you want to start?
Yeah, well, I can start. I think with I'll start with the Confucius Institutes, because that's maybe that's a little bit cleaner in some ways. So the NDAA defines what a Confucius Institute is, and it says that it's a cultural institute that is supported directly or indirectly by the People's Republic of China. So the name Confucius doesn't actually isn't actually in the definition. So it wouldn't be sufficient, for example, for an institution that has a Confucius Institute to say, well, now we're going to call it something else. If it still does the same things and it has the same funding structure, then it would be considered a Confucius Institute. And we've been trying to make that clear, both in correspondence with universities and through the Academy's activity. That is part of why the Academy is doing a part 2 of the study. Part of that is to focus on the Confucius-like things that are not Confucius in name, but may still may still fit that definition. But I think beyond that, even the purpose of the study, I think we're hoping that this would be helpful for the community, because today the issue is Confucius Institutes, but tomorrow the issue could be something else. And anytime we have a foreign funded institute on a university campus, it's probably good for the academic community to think a little bit about what are the conditions that they want to see to accept that funding, or if there's funding associated with it. Do they have control over the appointments that are made at the institute? Do they have control over the curriculum and other types of things? That's the sort of thing that was contained in the initial report from the academies, and that we hope that they will follow along with that work. And I think that's something that will be of enduring usefulness, is not just solving today's problem, but just looking at this more generally, and trying to set us all up so that we're not caught unawares in the future. On the other part of the talent programs, ideally in my mind, and let's let Rebecca chime in as well, but I think in my mind, the talent program, by the types of activities that it's trying to get an individual to undertake, right? If an individual is required to, for one, not disclose the relationship, and that should be a big red flag to people. If they can't get out of the relationship, there's no way of terminating it. That's problematic. If it asks them to engage in some of these problematic behaviors of, there's some unpublished research, and would you just send this over here? Or you have to hire individuals from this, national origin, or these types of things. Those are the types of activities that institutions should and researchers should be on the watch for. So I think it's probably more helpful to define them by the types of things that they're making people do. My 2 cents.
I agree, and that's why we wanted to make sure that we went with a definition rather than a list. And we also, of course, were very focused on distinguishing between foreign government talent recruitment programs overall and malign foreign talent recruitment programs, malign ones which have the characteristics that Jason mentioned, among others. There are many foreign government talent recruitment programs that may or may not consider themselves as such, but fit an overall definition, which is in NSPM 33 implementation guidance. And the implementation guidance makes it very clear that here's the overall definition, and then here's a subset that might be considered malign. That being said, I think it is incumbent upon all of us to work together with our researchers to help them and help them with understanding what these characteristics are, and again, why they're concerning, and then bring it forward and disclose if perhaps they may have signed up for one of these programs that might be considered malign.
Thank you, Rebecca. I wanted to mention that Susan Morgan was kind enough to put in the Q&A, if you have access to that, a link to a National Academy blog article from September about Confucius Institutes in the US. And I'll copy that over into chat so everybody has access to that. Jim, you want to ask the next question?
Sure.
If I could cut in for just a second. So the link, so NAS in this case is the National Association of Scholars.
Right.
So yeah, just so that no one gets confused between that and the academies. I think if we could post a link to the academies report, and I don't have that at my fingertips, that might be helpful. My only note of caution on the National Association of Scholars, in the past I have seen errors and lists that they've put out. So I would just take a little bit of caution with that. But in general, I think that many of those would be considered Confucius Institutes.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jason. Good clarification. We have about 4 more minutes, and Rebecca and Jason, if you have any closing comments at the end, we'll ask for that. Before our time is up in this little Q&A. But there is one more question about the research security program. I think that's one of the areas of the greatest interest as to, is this more FTEs? What is this going to cost? What are the expectations? We all have probably invested lots and lots of money over the last 4 years in new FTEs or bits and pieces of people. So is it about assembling it, restructuring it, how we convey it in an institution? Those are obviously areas of interest. This is specifically about the certification process and whether that will be open for public comment.
Yes, and we are in the process of developing the approach to the certification process, and that approach then will, of course, determine whether it needs to be open for public comment or not. So we'll coordinate for sure. And I don't mean to be non-transparent, but these certification processes, we're finding that various systems have various challenges to them. So originally we thought, okay, you can certify through sam.gov. It seems sam.gov is quite challenging to use. And so we're looking at what is the best system and how to do it. And that will, again, determine what needs to be out for public comment. We want to make sure, of course, that it's as simple as possible. On the question overall of FTE, we also are not going to dictate exactly to the letter of, what you need to do, how you need to do it, how many FTE. The standards will be, that the programs should have, the 4 different areas that are listed in NSPM 33, implementation guidance. And here's the floor of the types of things that should be part of that particular research security program. So I'm hoping that that's going to be more helpful, because we really wanted to take into account the different structures of different universities and the different sizes of different universities.
Thank you.
That's great. Thank you.
So I'll ask the last question, Rebecca and Jason, for this segment. That is, someone's asked whether they should use the State Department list to identify countries of concern, or is there another information source that provides that information?
So CHIPS and Science and NDA have it, right, Jason?
Right. My memory is that was that they defined it in CHIPS as, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and then it does say that the State Department may add additional countries of concern, but those are the 4 countries right now.
Thank you. Thank you so much for those great answers to these questions. We may get more during the course of the rest of the morning here, and if so, we will cycle back with you at the end.
Sounds great. Thank you.
But thank you again. So with that, we'll go forward. Sarah, if you want to advance the slides. As we said, now we're going to move on to our part 2. And we're very lucky to have Jean and Michelle here with us to talk about common disclosure forms and updates from their respective organizations. Next slide.
Okay, so we have identified that this is the part of the session where we're kind of changing gears here, and we're going to move towards the harmonization activity that has been underway for the biographical sketch and current and pending other support. I'm Jean Feldman from the National Science Foundation, and I will be joined by my colleague, Michelle Bowles from NIH, and we are co-chairing this activity on behalf of the Research Security Subcommittee of the National Science and Technology Council. So next slide, please. So a little background and context to make sure we're all on the same sheet of music about what's transpired so far, and a look forward to where we're going in the process. So the National Science and Technology Council's Research Security Subcommittee has, as you all are aware, because we have been talking about this for some time, been working on the development of common forms, and I'm going to explain that concept in a moment, about where we got that terminology and what the impact means for all of you, for both the biographical sketch and current and pending or other support for well over a year. And this is something that Christina Eller, who was working closely with us and was co-chair of the Research Security Subcommittee, was referred to as a labor of love. It's been kind of a challenging exercise, lots of different players, lots of different interests on the table to how we best go forward with this. And so it has been a challenging year, but that's what the purpose of this session is to give you a sense of where we're going. So NSF, NIH and OSTP, we did at the very outset, prior to publishing in the Federal Register, work with colleagues at OIRA, OMB's OIRA, Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, to work through a clearance process and use of the common form approach. And so we actually had folks that commented, well, you can't use this particular common approach because it's illegal. Well, it actually is not illegal. And OMB OIRA is the one that greatly suggested that this was a great path forward as an approach to use in implementation of this kind of concept. So what a common format would really mean to all of you is that NSF would serve as steward for these formats, as we have for both the research terms and conditions and for the research performance progress report, and would be responsible overall for publishing in the Federal Register and for soliciting those public comments, resolution of the comments, and for finalizing the comments in consultation and definitely with the involvement of NIH as co-chair and our other research agency colleagues. So it's definitely an approach that we'll all be working forward on. But what common means to the rest of you is that once these formats are developed and finalized, and then ultimately published in the Federal Register, that would serve as the baseline approach of what would be used by a particular agency. And so when you moved forward to clear your biographical sketch and your current and pending or other support, what OIRA would be very interested in seeing is, okay, are you using the baseline that was approved for use by NSF? And if not, if you've added things, they would be assessing the magnitude of those things for what kind of a process would be used to clear that agency's forms. With the concept being the closer you were to the baseline set of requirements, the less of a clearance process that you'd ultimately have to engage in, because NSF had already cleared those for use by other federal agencies. So that, in a nutshell, is what common form or common format means. And it is ultimately already being used for the RPPR as a path forward for how to best proceed with that concept. So we did publish, as already in some of the screenshots that have been used previously in this session, have been used to say, this is what we posted. We posted a notice, NSF did, requesting public comment in the Federal Register on August 31st, 2022. At that time, NSF developed a web page, if you will, that contained the common formats, the biographical sketch, all the associated data elements and instructions, the current and pending support and other support, and the associated data elements and instructions. A second piece of this that had the disclosure table, or the latest version of the disclosure table at the bottom, and also linked to the Federal Register notice. Next slide, please. So that has been out there to give a one-stop shop on what we were doing as part of this exercise. And in the description of what the purposes of this activity, the following statement was included. NSF, on behalf of the National Science and Technology Council's Research Security Subcommittee, is soliciting public comment on common disclosure forms for the biographical sketch and current and pending other support sections of a research application. An Excel spreadsheet that summarizes all of the data elements that will be collected in both the biographical sketch and current and pending other support, as well as their associated attributes, also is included for public comment. We did have a 60-day comment period, and that ended on October 31st, 2022. Next slide, please. Well, in terms of the context of what came in the door and what we're dealing with and resolving as we speak, there were 99 comments were received, and the submitters included individuals, organizations, professional societies, and federal agencies. But I should note that, as we do see in many cases, there was a group of commenters, which included AAU, COGR, APLU, a whole list, many individuals. Their comments were, we agree with that set of comments, and then they would provide some additional commentary, just to give you a sense of the caliber of the kinds of comments that we received. Now, the next slide is going to go into the kinds of comment areas that, or the common thematic areas. Yes, next slide. But I really wanted to turn it over at a high level to Michelle, because she had some comments that she wanted to make from an overarching perspective about what we saw in the comments that were submitted. Michelle.
Thank you, Jean, and thank you for that nice summary of how we've gotten to where we are. While we have some thematic areas, I would like to say that many of the comments that we received did seem to want to relitigate NSPM 33. And we had a really good discussion with our OSTP colleagues, just to make sure that they understood the basis for those comments. And a lot of those comments that we received in terms of relitigating NSPM 33, we as agencies did not feel that we had that authority to take a step back, but more importantly, to help others understand kind of where we are in terms of the themes, what we felt comfortable with addressing, what we felt OSTP needed to put back and think about, give it back to OSTP and let them think about how to move forward. But more importantly, us setting our pace and pushing the reset button on how we're moving forward. And it really did help us dig deep into further aligning the disclosure forms, the common forms, to be quite honest with you. There were some low-hanging fruit that I think Jean and I discussed in very detail. And there were some really high-level things that I think the OSTP will have to deal with the NSTC committee. So Jean, as you go through some of these themes, I think it's really important for folks to remember that NSPM 33 is out. The agencies have been charged with implementing it. And as we implement it, we have, NSPM 33 gave us 3 different areas by which we need to do things differently or can do things differently. And the charge that we were given by the NSPM 33, that is exactly what we did. We did exactly what the disclosure requirements identified. So I think it's important for us to just remember that while there are some challenges that I know that folks believe, the harmonization is going to be hard, and that some of the instructions may not be as clear as you want them to be, but that happens in a common form. I think it's really important for us to know that we have a charge, and that's exactly what we're doing, Jean.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And that, I think, provides kind of the first overarching glimpse of what we really found in these comments. But as Michelle and I took, the comments came in, obviously, I'd like to reiterate that the timing we were working on was a bit challenging because obviously, as you start hitting November and into December, it is a very, very challenging time in the federal government for folks to meet because it's heads into the holidays, and that has absolutely kind of made our challenge even more difficult in terms of proceeding quickly. And beyond that overarching that Michelle went into, one of the first things that we did was really take a deep dive in these comments and find out exactly where the buckets were of who else should be engaging in resolution of these comments. And Michelle is so accurate that we identified really 4 areas. OSTP, that it really fell into their purview. What instructions, for example, are you going to provide to the agencies on how much they can deviate from these common formats? So we have shared that feedback with Christina Eller, who unfortunately, and to our great unhappiness, has gone back to Harvard. And so we had to hastily get her initial engagement prior to having her leave OSTP. There were comments that addressed OMB OIRA and how they were going to be engaged in this process. And that is really important because we want to make sure that whatever we do is going to be consistent with how OIRA views these will ultimately be rolled out to the community. There were some specific agency comments, a few for NSF, a few for NIH, a few for the Department of Energy that obviously would have to be resolved by those individual agencies. And then finally, a lot of discussion in this space right now. Of course, you all understand it's already been submitted, discussed by Jason in the first part of this. Folks are hearing a lot about Science CV. Obviously, ultimately, as of right now, we have NSF, NIH, Department of Energy, and some of the Department of Education programs that have made commitments to use Science CV. So some comments were submitted that fell into the Science CV space. So once we took that first step of where do these comments fall, gave the comments to OSTP, got some resolution, we then put them into these thematic areas that I share with you on this slide. So obviously, there were some very discrete comments that had to do with the biographical sketch, the data elements, and the content. And obviously, probably one of the biggest comment areas has to do with definitions and adding definitions for that originally appeared in not just the implementation guidance, but before that NSPM 33 itself. So we had to work with and are working with OSTP on that. Current and pending or other support. Lots of comments on the particular data elements, instructions for that format. There were comments that had to do with the disclosure table that really was not part of this overall exercise, but that we included on the NSF page so that we could have that one-stop shop. But there were some general comments that really didn't fall into that folks felt like they needed to make to say, thank you for doing this exercise, kind of comments, or, more generically, how this process might move forward and the best way to do that. And then some very, very discrete comments on the accuracy of the agency's estimate. That would be NSF's. Obviously, we took that to heart. That was no other agencies, because NSF is the one that has to put this out. That's the common form approach or common format approach that one agency, NSF, is very much looking. Obviously, the sense was that it was much less than actually had to go on. We're taking that feedback to heart, and that would actually be incorporated when we moved to finalization and implementation of these formats. And then there were 3 areas that got to the ways to enhance the quality, utility, and clarity of the information on respondents through use of automated collection techniques or for other forms of information technology, the ways to minimize the burden of the collection of information on those who are respond, again, through use of automated, electronic, mechanical, or other collection techniques, and whether the proposed collection is necessary for the proper performance of the functions of the agency, and saying it wasn't possible to tell. But ultimately, at the end of the day, let me emphasize that that really is an agency determination. It has to be an agency determination whether the information is needed and has practical utility. So we have one more slide. Next slide, please, to just talk about where we are and what the next steps are. We wanted to make sure that we provided time to also give NSF updates and NIH updates on where we are as part of this process. But the next steps for this particular piece is that we are continuing the comment resolution process. Michelle and I have set up marathon sessions, if you will, to go over and complete our review of those 99 comments, considering the input that we have received from OSTP and others on where they think. We gave some options for OSTP to consider, and they gave us their feedback on whether they would support those options. So that's where we are. We have that part of the process. When we are done with that, though, we do need to meet with the NSTC Research Subcommittee co-chairs. They are absolutely the owners. That's why there's not more meat to this next steps, because they are going to guide the actual path forward for implementation of the common forms. And so we will be setting up a meeting for them after we've completed those marathon sessions. We are working this as hard as we can with a lot of what you see in interagency processes. There is virtually no individual that has NSPM 33 as their full-time job. We actually have other full-time, in fact, some would say multiple full-time jobs. And so we are working this as quickly and spending as much time and energy as we can to get this done. So those are the 2 immediate on our horizon next steps. With that, let me ask Michelle if she has any closing comments on this part of the presentation.
No, I think you've done a great job, Jean. And I think I just echo your sentiments about the fact that we've taken this process very seriously. And we've spent a lot of time talking about the comments, and you know how we go through and really dig deep into them. And we went back through the Excel spreadsheet and the instructions. And I assure our colleagues here that if you give Jean and I the job, we're going to take it to heart, and we're going to do the very best we can on behalf of the community. So as we move this process forward, and as we have set up our next 2 marathon meetings that are very spirited, I want you all to understand.
No, spirited is not. That's a very polite way to put it.
But it is because, we are truly trying to get at the heart of the comments and making certain that, we are not just speaking at the NSF or at the NIH, but thinking about this from a very broad perspective, which is what our charge was from our NSTC co-chairs and from OSTP. So we look forward to sharing the end game with you, and thank you so much for your patience with us on this.
Now, my colleagues, Pamela, Jim, do you want us to move? There aren't a lot of questions. Do you want us to move immediately into our agency updates and then we'll take comments? That would be great. That way we can make sure.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so we are going to now move to just a bit of an each agency, NSF and NIH update on where we are in terms of implementation of some of these. And so this is the NSF portion. Next slide, please. So you all have been hearing a lot from NSF in this space. So I really wanted to provide ample opportunity for my colleagues at NIH or my colleague Michelle at NIH to make sure that she has an opportunity to present where they are. So I have a few brief slides. Many of you have seen these and heard these. We did a session last week with thousands of participants on NSF's update or of the implementation on the biographical sketch and current and pending support. And so, which will be posted very shortly, and we will be sending out an email when it is ready, because it answered very, very many of the questions that folks have been having about the new formats for the biographical sketch and current and pending other support. But let me speak very highly at a very brief level on some of the issues that may be of concern to you. So obviously, in terms of what our revisions were for the 23-1 PAP guide, which goes into effect on January 30, 2023, we did include new certification requirements for the NDAA certification requirement that came out in 2021, Section 223, regarding information being accurate, current, and complete. I have some more detail on other slides about that. We also implemented the NSPM 33 with consistent disclosure requirements for senior personnel and for common formats for both the biographical sketch and current and other support. And let me say what I mean by that, because we are getting some questions in that regard. NSF, because we are the steward of these forms, really wanted to kind of use this as a first step in implementation of the harmonized form. So what NSF did is essentially take the biographical sketch common format and the current and other support format and implement those for NSF, a kind of kick the tires activity. And this is actually providing us with a lot of feedback on the kinds of questions that may be received. Ultimately, however, NSF will modify those in future issuances to implement whatever is ultimately put out for both the biographical sketch and current and pending support. But we wanted to make, so we're getting lots of questions on, hey, there looks like there's a lot of difference between the 22-1 version of the PAP guide and the 23-1 version of the PAP guide as it relates to those two templates. And again, I would say there are, simply because we are implementing what was initially put out for that public comment with regard to those two templates. We also took a definite statement on persistent ID. So when you go into those templates, you will see the word ORCID ID. It is not a mandatory requirement. It is optional. There is, again, not a requirement that you have an ORCID ID at this time. However, we think that the value for you, particularly for those And we definitely want to move folks to use of Science CV, of having an ORCID ID will help reduce administrative burden and help with pre-population. And as we go on and there are more linkages, there is a session on Science CV this afternoon that will be presented by Bart Twywick from NIH, the National Library of Medicine, that talks about this issue. And hopefully you can ask questions on what's next in that regard. Next slide, please. So in terms of the certification, we are getting lots of questions on this now, so we wanted to try to preempt that and give some basic information on the certification requirements. This is how it will be handled in Science CV. So the senior personnel have to certify that the information is accurate, current, and complete. And the certification to the right is precisely what they are certifying to. Some of this language, we're getting great feedback and great suggestions as part of the common format exercise and in the Federal Register on the actual certification language to streamline that. So thank you very much. But it basically says right now, when the individual signs the certification on behalf of themselves, that language actually was put in by other agencies. They are certifying that the information is current, accurate, and complete. This includes, but is not limited to, information related to domestic and foreign appointments and positions. And then it goes into the lovely requirements on misrepresentation and omission, and a tie to the False Claims Act and other acts regarding submission of information to the federal government. In Science CV, the certification is completed on download of the document. We have been receiving lots of comments on, well, this isn't how we currently do it in our process. The individual absolutely has to certify, and that has to be completed on download of the document. We do not want a delegate to be certified. That is not how this works and would not be compliant with NDAA. The certification or timestamp is included on the PDF. And if that information is ultimately changed prior to proposal submission, the information must be recertified by the individual. Next slide, please. Now, this is how it's going to work in the NSF fillable format. For the fillable forms, the senior personnel must type their name and date in the form, and that information is printed on the form. We're getting lots of questions about what precisely an institution has to do in this regard about, do they have to add DocuSign on top? Do they have to add some other form of electronic signature? What this has is the typed out name of the individual and the date. That is all we need right now. These formats are really, really very, very basic because, again, on October 23rd, 2023, we will be using to mandatory use of Science CV. That's the reason that this certification process is not as robust as Science CV, because we will only be using it for a very short amount of time. Next slide, please. So, initial disclosures and or update correction requirements. This is not new information. You have to update your information or provide the information at 4 parts of the process: initial proposal submission, prior to making a funding recommendation, post-award, and project reports. There has been no change to the process other than updating the templates for proposal submission. Pre-award, that is a new part of the process. Updated, current, and pending or other support may be requested by an NSF program officer, and that is when they are considering whether to make a funding recommendation and must be submitted for senior personnel before an award can be made. We have added a new notification that this is, this is a new part of the process, and we have implemented this process internally as part of our internal system, and provides a way for a program officer to easily request this information. It must be submitted by the organization and not the individual. And then post-award. Obviously, this is already in play, but what we have done here is that we have created a new notification for this purpose. Previously, it was submitted as an other request, that did not provide sufficient space for an AOR to provide all the information that was necessary. And then they would have to provide a secondary email with the information that was then not certified. So we built out a new notification in research.gov for this, excuse me, purpose. Then project reports. This has already been long-standing, that PIs and co-PIs must specify whether new, active, other support has been received in their annual final project reports. And if yes, they must include updated current and pending support information. Next slide, please. So sorry, this got messed up in the submission. These are some very basic FAQs that we've been receiving a lot of. I've really tried to make sure that on the first one, I've already answered it because we are getting so many questions. Should we use DocuSign or other electronic signature to certify the forms? And this is with respect to the fillable format. Again, we've gotten a lot of these. No, these are not required. What you do is type in the name and the date. Can I submit the updated formats prior to January 30? People want to do it now. No, actually, these will not be effective until the January 30. These are to provide opportunity for you to get ready, to look at the forms, to begin filling out the forms. So they cannot be submitted until that switch is turned on January 30. Can a delegate in Science CV download a document prior to it being certified by the senior personnel? No, the individual that is providing the information must certify prior to a delegate being able to download. And then finally, can we convert a prior form to be compliant with the new formats? That is something we're asked a lot about with Science CV. We're basically there working with Science CV, but there is something they are working on to make it happen. So we're just about there for that, because I know that that will be of great use to the community. That way they can take a 22-1, import it into the new template, and then only provide those updates where necessary. So with that, I want to make sure that I provide my colleague, Michelle, enough time to present the NIH update. So I am turning it over to her. There you go, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Jean, and thank you for your update. Alrighty, thank you guys for having us. NIH's disclosure update is not going to be as colorful as Jean's, but we do plan to have some things to share with you guys in the future. Next slide. So I want to just give you some context by which NIH has moved. We set out last year in 2022 where we required the signatures on the other support, and we also required other disclosure documents, supporting documentations, if you will. And one of the things that I think we wanted to do is we had our delay in OIRA, where we sent down our biographical sketch and we sent down our other support and our entire application package. And we had a slight delay. So we are a bit behind in updating our bio sketch and our other support to align ourselves with the common forms, or some of the key principles that we know won't change within the common forms. But I will say this, we are moving forward with the implementation here in the future, where we are talking about adding the persistent identifier and making that a option for senior key personnel. As you guys know, NIH, we dipped our toe in the water a bit with our trainees and our career awards and fellows, and I think it's our research education awards. So we've kind of played in this space a lot, and we have a lot of folks that have used the ORCID ID, but we are going to make that a strong recommendation for that to be used in the coming new forms that we will be issuing. We also, as you all know, require the electronic signatures on the other support, and we'll have that aligned with our bio sketch, and we will update that certification language to make sure that we highlight the accurate, current, and complete requirement and align with the certification requirements from NSPM 33 and NDAA. So what you will see very much is what the common form will bring, but more importantly, I think what Jean has presented today, which is what the plan is in the future, and that's what we did have approved by OIRA. Just didn't have the chance to get the forms out and implemented at this time. You guys know we are deep in the data management and sharing policy implementation. So it's one step at a time here. As Jean mentioned several times, we have so many different plates in the air, trying to get the grants policy statement out, trying to get our application forms out, Forms H, and then of course implementing VMS. So we are a bit lagged here, but be assured that we will be aligning with our colleagues. The additional updates or plan is that we will adopt the common form once it's approved. And like we all know, there are some areas whereby, because we are a federal agency and we have our own requirements and statutes and our own authorities, we have to be able to identify very closely with that. So there are some nuances that that will take place, not might. But for the most part, we have really done a really good job in trying to marry some of the nuances and some of the differences that we've had with the common form exercise. And I think that's where we find our spirited comments and our spirited discussions during our meetings. We are determined to do our page limitations, because that might be something that we will need to retain. We are looking at the personal statement and looking at changes to the contributions to science. And then we are going to modify and relax somewhat our hyperlink policy. So that's going to be a really, really good thing. Next slide, please. For the other support form instructions, the OMB approval that was received will include the optional identifier, the ORCID ID. Again, certification language is already there. We also want to make sure that the additional updates that are planned immediately are truly aligned with the NIH forms having the common form principles. And again, always needing to identify the agency needs. And so we will have some differences, and I've outlined them in the previous slide. We are looking at some NIH specific areas. And that's because we are thinking about this a bit differently as we're looking at other significant contributors. And in the past, NIH has not had any measurable efforts, so that doesn't quite align with key personnel. And so some of these nuances that we've had in the past will be reviewed and thought out, and the policies, in fact, will change to align with the requirements of NSPM 33. We're also looking at methods for submitting supporting documentations, which is, of course, the integration with Science CV. And I do anticipate that that will be something that will be coming in the next fiscal year. Next slide. And so the DPI, of course, is the requirement. The signature certification is a requirement that we're going to modify to have this aligning, this language in our biosketch, in our other support, so that it aligns with NSPM 33, as well as our common forms and those that we have had approved and agreed to throughout the area. Now, I will say that we've picked up 5 different versions of this. So if I have it wrong, Jean, you better tell me because I don't think this is it. I think it's the other one that I had on my other slide. So forgive me for that. And I will make sure that I alert my staff too. But I will say also that, where we started is here, and then we moved into another different direction. So as long as I have it on the other slide, I'm good. And as long as we have it in our common forms, we're good, since we will be adopting them. Next slide, please. We will be implementing the Science CV templates. We are working very closely with BART on these. And as a matter of fact, we're going to jump right into it now that we have our form approved by OIRA. So now what we're going to be doing is working on the adoption of the common form. And what we're hoping is that if NIH does not see any movement within the next few months, we're going to have to go ahead and adopt some areas that really have to be adopted, because there's just no way we can hold it up and have the community in limbo. And this is something that's really important to me professionally, and to NIH, I know, as a whole, the leadership. And Gina and I have had this discussion where, you have to kind of go out there on a limb, and you have to at least acknowledge and adopt and implement those areas that you just know are not going to change. And so those are the things that I'm planning to do. And they're listed here on the slide. And we'll be working with BART in a really meaningful way, because we will probably be adopting a lot of what Jean's group has put together with the Science CV folks, so that we can, again, that next layer of harmonization, and just really only implementing those areas that we just agency specific needs, and it's because of our authorities. Next slide, please. So I have here the email addresses for you, and we also have policies, forms, and FAQs. But I think the real message here today is that, we're kind of caught in between a rock and a hard place, in that we had a delay in our approval from our Forms H, and we have to implement that, and we have to implement that soon. But as we implement it, we will be implementing those major requirements that are outlined in NSPM 33 and aligning with the Science CV work that has already been done by NIH colleagues as well as NSF. So with that, I will stop here and turn it back over to you, Pam.
Okay, thanks so much, Michelle. Well, on behalf of everyone here, first, we will take a couple of questions. We know we're over time. We do have permission to run a little over for anyone that can stay. We hope that our panelists are able to stay, but we realize how crazy your calendars are. We'll try to get all the information out to all of the panelists. But before that, let me just say again, thank you all so much. And Sarah, welcome to the family, because you are in a great family, and we're really looking forward to working with you, in addition to everyone else here, and all of the partnership that you have with FDP in particular, in terms of trying to make this work from the beginning, with all of the stakeholders. So again, thank you for that. I'm going to ask the first question and switch it up a little bit because it's coming up several times in the Q&A. People are very curious. I know this is hard, but do you have any sense of timing? Do you have any sense when two things? One is where it's likely that we'll see another version of either a draft version or a final version of the forms. And then the other half of that is how, do you have any idea of the amount of time between when those final forms are released and when they will become mandatory?
Well, I'm happy to take the last one first because that actually does not fall in our hands.
That's right.
That's one of those where the forms Michelle and I are working on behalf of the Research Security Subcommittee. And that is an OSTP decision based on, okay, we have resolved these comments. What are really the next steps? How are they going to be rolled out? OSTP, OMB, there are a lot of questions in that space. So I mean, I really, that's not a question that we can absolutely answer at this time. Michelle, anything?
No, I absolutely, yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. That is definitely not within our bailiwick, but I will say that what is in our bailiwick is the fact that we are setting aside a couple of sessions to go through the comments. We anticipate being done with those within the next couple of weeks, and we will turn over the resolution of those comments to our NSTC co-chairs to make sure that they are pleased with where we've landed. And then that will be taken to OSTP. And then from there, it's out of our hands.
Okay. And just remember that before we even went through this process with all of you, we had a first step of getting federal agency input. And we received and interestingly enough, a few of the things you don't like at all, we were given as part of that change process. So we will actually have to work within those constraints as well to see how OSTP wants to engage the other federal agencies in this process as well. And we don't have the answer to that question. So that really answers both in a way that, you know, we would love to provide more detail, but we're really able to provide where we are now and a couple steps from here with where they would ultimately go in conversations with OSTP.
And Jean Michelle, that makes
great.
Perfect.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and you know, you have a standing offer to come back to FDP for the rest of your lives. So please mark that
I
on
feel
your
like
calendars.
this is taken on a life of its own. And I can assure you, there is one thing I am certain of in this space, and I don't say this often, as that Michelle and I want to have this assignment completed more than any other two people, because it continues to be on our plate.
You said it right, Jean.
So I'll ask one quick question and then maybe Pamela, you can sign us off. The one quick question is, there were a couple of questions about APIs. Is there going to be some work done to make APIs work? Is that a quick answer possibly?
Well, I can answer it very quickly and provide you some, hey, you may want to do this. So there's a session today with Bart Trawick and rolling out. NSF will participate because there are some policy questions that have been submitted, but it would be very, very helpful for you to make Bart aware of the high priority this is, so that he understands from a community perspective, this is vital. So that's a great encouragement to not only show up, but also contribute that's an important issue from a research organization perspective.
Yeah, because those are areas that Bart will be able to absolutely help us with as he's designing these things.
Right.
And finding out later is not helpful. So we just want to make sure that we get ahead of it. And he's phenomenal. So
yeah.
Okay.
Great.
Well, again,
thank you.
We are out of time, but again, one final thank you, Rebecca, Jason, Sarah, Michelle, Jean. You're, as usual, amazing. And there was so much information that you put in this session for all of us. It just feels good to know the latest and know what we can know, what's still coming. And it really helps us feel as though we are current with you in terms of where everything is. So thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
See you in May in person.
Yeah.
In May in person.
Okay.
See ya. Thank you.
Bye-bye.